Hamid is a professor of Iranian studies and comparative literature at Columbia University. Hamid writes in the areas of Iranian studies, medieval and modern Islam, comparative literature, world cinema, and the philosophy of art. And he's also a founding member of the Center for Palestinian Studies at Columbia University. Most recently, Hamid has authored The Arab Spring, The End of Postcolonialism, Being a Muslim in the World, and Can Non-Europeans Think?
Good afternoon, everyone. Let me begin by first and foremost expressing my gratitude, Mr. Thomas, to the original inhabitants of this territory on whose land we have gathered here. I'm utterly delighted to report that I just came from Columbia University, where my university in Manhattan just acknowledged the Lenape nation on whose territory we have our campus. Now, when I crossed the border this morning to come from New York here, the distinguished Canadian custom officer, state representative, asked the Canadian driver who was kindly driving me if she had purchased something in the US, and asked me if I had any gun. I did not have a gun, nor did the driver had purchased anything. But that is excellent. An aspect of assemblage. One of the key aspects of it is, of course, the re-territorialization. I simply came from one territory of Native Americans to another territory. But I had to go through a state-sponsored border that asked me if I have a gun. I'm 65 years old. I have never seen, I'm happy to say, the sight of any gun. The other indication of this assemblage is the fact that one of my distinguished co-Palinists, Glenn and I have written 2 books in the span of 3 years. Mine came in 2011, Glenn's came in 2014. Mine was called Brown Skin White Masks, and his is called Red Skin White Masks. Both of us are giving homage to Fanon's Black Skin White Mask. This, again, another excellent example, 3 different categories, one North African, one in Islamic Arab context, one in North American context, that one idea begins to circulate and generate similar ideas, similar sentiments and similar thinkings, not identical, similar. These are 2 different things. Now, let me, and of course my gratitude to Janet and her colleagues for including me in this extremely important conversation. Janet's intuition that something has happened since 2010, perhaps 2009, perhaps 2008, because when an epistemic change is happening, we don't know exactly when it is happening. That's the definition of an epistemic change. If we know it, then it is not an epistemic change. Her own remarks about this notion of assemblage and to what degree it is helpful has laid out the project. What I thought I will do is to give you a genealogy of how my own thinking began to happen soon after the Arab revolutions. Arab Spring began to occur in late 2009 with the suicide of the Tunisian food peddler Mohamed Bouazizi, and then soon after that in January, when the uprising began in Tunisia, and after that in Egypt, and then Libya, etc., etc. About a year before that, 2008, we had also a bizarre movement in Iran, 2008. Bizarre, I say, because as the students of Iranian social intellectual history, we didn't know quite how to read it. It was an extraordinary moment. It was called Green Movement simply because it came from the color of a campaign of a presidential nominee, Mir Hossein Mousavi, that just became Green Movement. When I began to think and read and write about that movement, the government called it a seditious movement sponsored by CIA. The expat revolutionaries who were smoking something that I don't know exactly what they thought is a revolution on the model of, Marxist revolution. And to me, it didn't appear as a revolution, but I didn't know exactly what it is. So I began to call it, for me, the key was this phrase, "Where is my vote?" which was the major slogans. And I began to read it not only as a challenge to the veracity of the post-presidential election, that this is the president and not that person, but as a whole problem of post-colonial nation states and the idea of democracy in post-colonial nation states, that where is my vote, that vote is not in your pocket, that Khamenei could reach out and say, "Oh, well, here is your vote," or "I will do a recount." That where, to me, where is my vote, was far more quintessential. So this was in June 2009, and I was with Marwan Bishara, my colleague on the Empire program in Al Jazeera. We were having a chatting, talking about the Green Movement, and I just off the cuff, I said, this is June 2009, July 2009, a month after the thing had started in Iran. I said, if I were a person in a position of authority anywhere from Morocco to Syria, I would look at what is happening in Iran seriously, because the demographic composition of Iran is identical. It's 80 million. The demographic composition of 80 million Iranian is identical with the demographic composition of almost 300 million Arabs from Syria to Morocco. This is 6 months before the Arab revolutions began. When the Arab revolutions began, two slogans, I walk you through the slogans because they are indexical expression. One slogan was when the Egyptians began the revolution, they had one tiny little slogan addressing the Tunisians. They said, "Antum as-sabighun," which is the Quranic passage. "Antum as-sabighun wa nahnu lahiqun." You were the first, we came second. So already we're crossing post-colonial national boundaries. But the second slogan of the Arab Revolution, which was exceptionally important to me, and in fact my whole book is predicated on this slogan, is "Ash-Sha'b yurid isqat an-nizam." People demand the overthrow of the regime. Now, people demand overthrow of the regime at the moment was very simple. They wanted irhal, as they said to Mubarak, go. Mubarak should go. That's one form of reading, people demand the overthrow of the regime. But both the word nizam in Arabic and regime in English or French, etc., have far more different calculus of power. So one of the things that I began to do in the book is to read the regime in a kind of a Foucauldian way, à la régime de savoir, manner of knowledge production. And my proposal was that the kind of knowledge that we had accumulated prior to 2009, 2010, and we were bringing it to our understanding of the Arab revolutions, were no longer sufficient. That we had reached a moment of epistemic shift. We kept assimilating backward what we were watching into what we already knew. Within the disciplinary formations, political scientists, sociologists, anthropologists, historians, area specialists, this, that, the other thing. Just assimilating it backward in order to understand it. Whereas the reality itself, as Janet said, we didn't anticipate it. No revolution is ever anticipated. That's why Marx was so excited at the beginning of 18th Brumaire, because he didn't, as late as a few years ago when he wrote Marx's Communist Manifesto, he was not expecting it. But then when it happens, it is exciting. So this regime of knowledge was the beginning of the moment that I began to see that what we had known about revolutions, understood from revolutions, was no longer sufficient. Something was happening. And remember, this is long before the Indignato movement, the anti-austerity movement, the Wall Street Occupy movement, Black Lives Matter. This is long, long before that. We are still within the operation. Tunisia, Egypt, a little bit in Morocco, certainly in Bahrain, something in Yemen, beginning of rumbles in Syria, and that's about it. One of the things that I began to do was to realize that most of the slogans and demands was no longer in the spirit of anti-Western, anti-colonial elements. It was just kind of subsumed under it. It was something else what was happening, which I thought, and I spoke and read and wrote about this in the spirit of what I called, and developed it in the book, liberation geography. That the geography has altered. This was no longer East versus West. This was not Islam versus West. That particular binary had a genealogy. It happened at a particular period of time, which I had documented before when I wrote against Samuel Huntington. And this was a ground zero of a revolutionary uprisings that no longer had. It was a moment of what Deleuze and Guattari called deterritorialization. That the territorialization of the East and the West, and Islam and this, and West is this, the West and the rest, was for this movement had exhausted itself, was no longer operative. That was another concept I developed. Another idea that I developed was the whole notion of revolution. What does revolution mean? So I began to take to task the notion of total revolution and came up with the idea of open-ended revolution. Yes, there is a Trotskyist element in the notion of open-ended revolution, but that I did not have Trotsky in mind. Believe it or not, I had Bakhtin in mind. Here, I thought the period of epic revolution, Gamal Abdel Nasser and Muhammad Mossadegh and Gandhi, that was epic. One epic hero comes, leads the revolution, you come to promised land, hammer and sickle goes up, all is hunky-dory. I thought that we had exorcised that out of our system. We no longer were in the period of hammer and sickle going up and total revolution. This was open-ended revolution. And I say Bakhtin, in the model of Bakhtin's theory of novel in the Poetics of Dostoevsky, that heteroglossia comes into operation and you don't know what happens in the next page because the actors are different. So there are unanticipated consequences to a social movement. The other thing that corresponded just about this time with the notion of assemblage is when I continued my conversation with my late colleague Edward Said, the question of Orientalism. And I began to look specifically at what Habermas calls bourgeois public sphere. Now, Nancy Fraser has done exquisite critique of Habermas's notion of bourgeois public sphere, which is very Eurocentric. I mean, I'm not against Eurocentric. My best friends are Eurocentric. I'm just saying it has a limitation of what it can teach me when I go outside Europe. So, because I think, again, another footnote, worse thing, more than Eurocentric that you have to be afraid of is Europhobia. It's like a bad breaking up. If you have really broken up, you just go your own ways. If you continue to be, attacking Europe, then that means you're not done with Europe. So this Eurocentrism of Habermas is not an issue. Nancy Fraser has an excellent critique of it. But important thing is that she has that there is a transnational public sphere. Then I finished a book a couple of years ago, Persophilia, in which I began to look not at Orientalism in general, but the manner in which Europeans were attracted to things Persian. And here a different thing began to happen. So when, for example, Nietzsche writes Thus Spoke Zarathustra, you cannot call Nietzsche an agent of colonialism and knowledge production in service of imperialism. He is revolutionizing the whole history of philosophy. You cannot tell him that he's doing that. Or when Montesquieu is writing Persian letters, just before he writes The Spirit of Laws, is a different kind of Orientalism. To make a long story short, what I argued was that this notion of Persia and Persians and Matthew Arnold writing Rustam Sohrab and etc., was integral to social movements on the European bourgeois public sphere that then, through the operation of globalized capital, actually goes viral, quote unquote, globally. And anywhere that British imperialism goes, Omar Khayyam goes to, on the back of British imperialism. What becomes significant for European bourgeoisie becomes significant for globalized bourgeoisie. This idea of regional and global, but by all means transnational public sphere, upon which the idea of nation is paradoxically constructed, led me to in my most recent book, the title of which is Iran Without Borders, in which I propose the idea of Iran was formed outside Iran. Most of the intellectuals, most of the critical thinkers, the first Iranian novel was written in India, the first Iranian fiction was written in Egypt, the first Iranian major intellectual journal was published in Berlin, etc., etc. And the topography is not Europe or even West Toxication, has nothing to do with that. You have Cairo, you have Mumbai, you have Istanbul, you have and Berlin and other places. This opening up the fictive post-colonial nation state led me to the next step, to decouple nation and state. That this whole proposition of nation and state is a colonial manufacture, has nothing to do with us. So we have to separate the idea of nation and the idea of a state. Now, this is not just classical anarchy. Happy to be identified with that. But it is beyond the anarchy. It is not that I have any hostility towards this state. I don't have any use for this state. That means that you begin to articulate the manner in which the nation is formed. And here I take serious issues with people like Benedict Anderson and others, as nation becomes shared memories. And that shared memory has to do with a question of territoriality and deterritorialization and re-territorialization. Let me remind you of the extraordinary text of Bartolomé de las Casas, short account of the destruction of the Indies, which is one of the, now falsely, Bartolomé de las Casas, who was not concerned about Native Americans being slaughtered by the conquistadors. He was concerned that these are the properties of the king, and they should not be mistreated. That is the nature of the account. But the account is important because it's the moment of the re-territorialization of the territory that had a history, had a culture. I don't have to lecture you about that in this particular gathering. To conclude, I'm being given signal that I only had 2 minutes about 5 minutes ago. Yes, the theory of assemblage has a lot to tell us, because the simultaneous, almost simultaneous occurrence of Arab Spring, Indignato movement in Spain, anti-austerity from Greece all the way to UK, Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, these cannot be accidental. Now, now we enter a point, how do we explain them? One explanation is crisis of the capital. Well, capital has been in crisis since its very beginning. But we have two critical Marxist thinkers. One is Rosa Luxemburg. The more that passes, I become convinced that she is the figure that for now that we need to think about. Because it was Rosa Luxemburg's correction to Marx's theory of a revolution that was about to happen in Europe, and why did it not happen. It is Rosa Luxemburg that said Marx disregarded the significance of the colonial operation of capital. Namely, the colonial lands expanded the operation of the capital. As a result, the accumulation of capital and the tension and the crisis that it generates goes globally. That, and then the next critical figure is, of course, Gramsci, when he talks about hegemony and the manner in which we become invested in the operation of the capital, as you see it today in the election right now in the United States. This crescendo of sexual harassments, etc., of this monster Donald Trump, which is not accidental to the United States, is definitive to the United States, is all orchestrated for people to run and vote for Hillary Clinton, God's gift to humanity. Trump is nothing but what the United States have done around the globe. Excuse me the expression. He is a son of a bitch, but he is our son of a bitch. Who said that? And about whom?
Lyndon B. Johnson about...
Roosevelt about Anastasia Somoza.
No, wrong period, I think.
At any rate, an American about the Latin America, an American about the Latin America. Right now, this time is reversed. Namely, this one is their own son of a bitch. It's nobody else's son of a bitch. The key is to begin to rethink the relation between the colonial and the capital. As I always say, colonialism is the abuse of labor by capital times geography. That's all there is to it. You should not fetishize colonialism is not something that happens there. Colonialism is something that happens here, is always here. If you want to talk about cheap labor, there is as much cheap labor in Manhattan as it is in Guatemala. Capital chases after cheap labor chases after capital. That's all there is to it. 320 million cheap labor are chasing after capital. Okay, what does capital do? Dodges and goes after cheap labor. So all this notion of walls and this, of course, is silly. What wall? Where? Cheap labor always crosses the border, and you keep them illegal because they cannot unionize and organize and so forth. The rhetoric of, I promise this is the last sentence I said, do not panic. The rhetoric of increasing securitization of the state apparatus, of our reduction of us to this digitized aspect and total state, I call the formation of ISIS from all this magnificent revolutionary uprising that you saw, the landscape of Arab revolutions, which had to do with urbanity, which had to do with squares, from Gezi Park to Tahrir Square, squares around the globe began to rename themselves Tahrir. I was in Gwangju in South Korea for a conference giving a paper on the significance of squares in revolutions, and there was a Tahrir Square in Gwangju, South Korea. They were in England, they were all over the place. That is the question of city and urbanity and density of population was far more important than the artificial borders of this estate and that estate, and so forth and so on. My proposal is that yes, assemblage has a lot to teach us, but there is a moment that I came to the conclusion that two magnificent theorists, one a film theorist and one a philosopher, Sergei Eisenstein's notion of montage and Walter Benjamin's notion of fragments as allegory. Fragments as allegory. Okay, in his book on German drama. Fragments as allegory means the formation of a new global assemblage beyond specificities of established geography. The Syrian migrants who are coming and refugees who are coming and crossing Europe, they are making right-wing fascists of Europe as much nervous as they do European philosophers like Zizek. Zizek knows how to camouflage it in a lovely Marxist European language that is palatable, but they are nervous because the binary is being dismantled. The border is being crossed, and it requires a different way of thinking because the metaphor of the West is collapsing. And with the collapse of the metaphor of the West, is not making metaphors is definitive to us. We will continue to make metaphors, but different kinds of metaphors. There are histories of these metaphors. I'll give you just one example of magnificent Spanish historian, Americano Castro, In 1950s, he ran away from Franco, came to Princeton, wrote one book called The Spaniards and Their Histories, in which he said, he was a linguist, I will decouple Spain from its European myth and reconnect it to its Iberian reality and its Jewish and Islamic heritage. And as a result, a whole different Mediterranean world reappeared. Yes, assemblage is important. However, key factor is the dismantling of the state. And in my current work, there are 3 sites of the dismantling of the state: Zapatistas in Chiapas, Palestinians in Palestine, Rojava in the Syrian Kurdistan. These are the sites of new experimentation with non-state, supra-state, under-state, however you wish to call it, of rethinking notions of revolutionary liberation. Thank you for your time, and sorry if I ran as I did.